Welcome back to Value Creation Nation, everybody. This is your host, Lane Taylor. Thanks so much for coming into episode 4 today. If you were counting, there's 5 episodes out, but this is episode 4. So over the past episodes, Gene and Scott have challenged us to think differently about creating business value. So we've started exploring why inventory shouldn't be viewed as simply as an operational necessity, but as a strategic asset that impacts profitability, cash flow, customer satisfaction, and long-term competitive advantage. In the most recent episode, we shifted the conversation from managing operations to measuring them with the Balanced Scorecard. So have you not listened to any of these episodes, if you haven't listened to Inventory Management Part 1, Part 2, or Balanced Scorecard, please go back and check those out, whether it's on Apple, whether it's on Spotify, whether it's on YouTube. But really what happens now is we're going to talk about risk management in today's episode. So even when the strategy is clear, your performance is improving, how do you protect your business from the unexpected? So that's what Gene and Scott are going to cover today. And so with that, Gene and Scott, welcome back to your show, Value Creation Nation. Let's dive into the question and transition into risk management, all things risk management. Talk about it. Gene, we'll kick it over to you first and give an overview of really risk management and what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, thanks, Elaine. We appreciate it. And another important issue for just about every company, and it's certainly gained in popularity over the last couple of years, is managing risks. And why is that? Because so many risks are popping up all the time, almost every day in your business. And of course, every business issue or process has a risk. What we want to convey is that risk is a shared business objective. So it has a value creation aspect to it, especially if you can lose value if you don't protect yourself or mitigate the risk. Certainly you can add value if you have a good mitigation plan for those critical risks that are important to you. And what that basically is the question, what your business cares about the most. So that's what risks really have to do with. And we've got a slide here that shows the overall risk management process.
Guys, last time we talked about the Balanced Scorecard. The Balanced Scorecard pivots on a critical concept of the business managing the critical few metrics that ensures you deliver the performance that you've promised to the street, to your customers, and to the business. The risk management aspect of that are all the things that could impact your performance. So reality sets in. You're running your business, things happen around you, things can happen that impede the flow of goods, could impact the cost of capital, working capital, could have a pandemic, which affects your workforce. There are things that could happen, and if there are certain elements that are critical to you being able to deliver, you want to put in place a robust risk management program that helps you sort of focus on those things which are most important to delivering on that promise, and ensure that the business is always being sensitive to what's happening in the environment around them so that they have visibility and can take proactive actions to be able to basically deal with risks and things that happen that aren't natural, aren't normal. Right. So the risk register plays to the Balanced Scorecard. It's a connected concept. The Balanced Scorecard is what you're going to manage on a regular basis. The risk management tool is what should be underlying behind that. The Balanced Scorecard isn't something you create once and it's static. The Balanced Scorecard is something that should be dynamic. So based on the environment that you're in, the risks that the business is being impacted by, your Balanced Scorecard should change from period to period and quarter to quarter. Whatever the regularity is of the business condition changing, you should be adjusting your Balanced Scorecard. So if there's certain, for example, if there's certain new items that are critical and you delivering for that period, that quarter's performance, the Balanced Scorecard should look at the performance of that new product being delivered, the on-timeliness, the quality that's coming out, the margin that's being delivered, the sell-through rate, the profitability. That should be baked into your Balanced Scorecard for that period of time. So we didn't bring it up in our last discussion, but a Balanced Scorecard should not be static. It should be dynamic. And part of what should feed into that Balanced Scorecard comes from the risk assessment. And that should impact the additional operational things that the business should focus on and be monitoring to ensure that they can deliver on the promise for that period of time. All right, Gene, you can pick back up now the sheet's up. Now say that what we're showing is, and then describe what's on that sheet.
Okay, so this graphic shows overall supply chain risk management, which is largely a part of the risk management program for an enterprise. It's not all of it, however, but it's part of it. And we often get the question, how does risk management differ from resilience? Since most supply chain companies have been working on resilience for the last few years. Resilience basically is meant to describe how the company responds or gets protected from big shocks like supplier problems, shortages, and things of that type, which are basically risks. So if you're resilient, it means you have backup plans, which can also be in the risk management dashboard. So we want to look at risk management from an enterprise level across all the processes and look at what's most important to the company. At the same time, supply chain will have no doubt be working on backup suppliers and some of those more obvious things that have to do with what's defined as resilience. Now, there's so many risks out there. This slide shows categories here, and that lately we've seen risks in data, we've seen risk in fraud, in theft, and so forth. So the amount of risk is growing, and it's all the more reason why we believe and we know that leading companies, and you should be establish some kind of a risk management process for your business. And we'll get into that as well. And as Scott touched on risk register, it's a key part of that. But identifying the risks that are of most important to you is the first step. And that's what this slide is showing.
All right. So for those of you who aren't able to see the visual, what we have is we have a pinwheel. The pinwheel is a circular thing with flower petals on it. There are 10 different elements to this pinwheel. In each of those elements, we identify what risk management should include, starting with understanding sort of a risk review, what's important to the business, moving to the sources of risk, then how do you assess the impact of risk and what is impactful to you, which leads to in pedal number 4, a risk register. A risk register is a way that the business can monitor risks and have a regular feedback of that. Pedal 5 goes to visibility. How do you give business visibility across the entire business so that everybody is fully aware of what's happening and what's impacting the business? Moving to supplier collaboration. And then we move across to regulatory compliance in pedal 7. Then we have risk mitigation strategies in pedal 8. Pedal 9 is crisis management, which is how do we want the business to respond when a risk elevates itself? We should have a plan for each risk and what the game plan is ahead of time when we have time to think through each of the potential risks and how we want the business to respond. A communication plan, the authority, the decision maker, and the recovery strategies. And then pedal 10 gets into the continuous improvement, which is how do we continue to rework that whole pedal to identify additional risks to the business and then work through the strategy about how that might be monitored and then what the mitigation strategies would be. The value of putting in place a program like this is also demonstrated on the right side of this slide because it really creates value. It creates value in understanding things that are changing within the business, elevating to the senior management team, the decision makers on the team, things that are happening around the world that impact what you assumed the marketplace would look like, what you assumed your profitability statement would look like. And it gives you the ability to recognize what's happening, see the trends, see the geopolitical risks that are happening. You look at the Strait of Hormuz at the time of this discussion. That's a risk from a raw materials and fuel perspective. If you understand the impact on oil and the flow of oil, it will have impact to the cost of freight and the cost of transportation, both domestically. So it's seeing what the ripple effects are of these, navigating the risks that are being elevated and sharing it to the business, not just the owner of a functional area, but sharing it to the entire business so that the entire business is aware of the issues that they're grappling with so that they can begin to take mitigating aspects on the areas that they have ownership for to see if they can find savings to offset some of the impacts of some of the risks that the business is going to have to address. So the format that we put on the slide helps to elevate both the internal and external risks that need to be contemplated, and puts it in a way that can be reviewed and thought about in a systematic way.
Let me bug in here for a second and ask a question. And when it comes to businesses and risk management and what you just showed our listeners and what you just spoke through, is it common practice with big businesses and organizations to take the time to have these processes in place with risk management? Is it something that just to maybe a C-suite or a C-level say like, we'll deal with risk when it gets there, we don't have to worry about it? Where are businesses nowadays when it comes to risk management?
The idea of risk has been around a long time in the financial world. When public companies make shareholder reports, they're basically required by GAAP to divulge the risks of any venture, whether it be an investment or whatever. That, however, has been overcome by the real world, which shows that risks are more prevalent today and provide a longer shock than they used to. And so it does affect your performance of the business. So risks have come out of the shareholder reports into the operations of a company. Some companies, especially the large ones, have appointed a chief risk officer, and his or her job is to make sure there are risks being identified by each unit of the business and that something is being done with risk owners for those. That has given way in the larger companies to a formalized process where there may be a risk council and there may be monthly meetings of updates, and the risk platform, if you want to call it that, or dashboard, it changes by what's going on in the marketplace. And to Scott's point, what's important to you may change when you experience a risk or one comes close to getting to you. And there's an action plan for what do you do when the risk is imminent. So yes, it's become out of the financial reporting into the operations of a business.
So to play on that a little bit, I think what Gene's articulating is, instead of it being an activity that happens once a year to look at things that could impact a business, what we're stressing is it needs to be an active activity that happens on a daily, weekly basis, where there needs to be an owner that's in tune geographically around the world to all the things that are happening and the things that will affect your business. Okay, so it's going from reporting as a necessity to being very active in the business and providing business decision support assistance, to helping the business first to recognize that something happened and now I'm impacted. So for example, if you have a flood in Thailand and where the flood happened is the place where all of your hard drives come out of, which is a real life example, and you didn't realize that was your sole source for the world for your hard drives, now you need to know, and you need to know immediately, that you've just lost your worldwide supply of hard drives. That was a real situation that happened about 10 years ago. So things that happen around the world that seem to be disparate or may not be highly reported or publicized have real effects. A flood in a certain geography that affects a major production site is important for you to know because that'll affect your source of supply. Right? Macro things will be evident, things that affect the world in general. So the Strait of Hormuz, oil prices, gas prices, those things are highly reported, but there are a lot of regional things that aren't reported that are impactful to an individual business that may not be impactful to the world or extremely impactful to a business. And so you need to have a program that actively seeks out and has sensitivity to, where do I need to keep my ear to hear the news that's coming out of those areas? And once I hear it, what does that mean to me and what do I need to do to respond? The quicker you can respond, the faster you'll be at offsetting any impacts your competitor may be doing, because most likely they're probably in the same regions of the world that you are. The faster you can acknowledge and take action, the more opportunities you'll have to actually be able to mitigate it with all the options available to you. The slower you are to recognize it, the more you're going to be impacted by others that are already taking action, and that'll sort of corner you into higher prices and less solutions. So what we're proposing is a very active program Gene articulated where the biggest of businesses, the Fortune 50 and Fortune 100, have recognized that this is critical in them delivering their promise to the street. So they have begun to invest in teams that do this active management. Those that are past the Fortune 100 and down into middle market typically don't have the resource availability to have this active program. We're proposing that they create a system that feeds this kind of news and information to them. And with AI, it's now becoming more and more available, that they one, acknowledge what's critical to them, and they use active services to feed them data where someone has the responsibility to filter that to the team, assess what the information is telling you and what that impact is to the business, so the business can proactively begin to respond to shocks and risks that are impacting them.
Yeah. Okay. So now I want to. This is a thought, and you transitioned a little bit to it, which I thought was incredible. Because my question is, from the not the big boys, obviously the middle markets and things like that. Because from a sales and marketing standpoint, my mind goes to, well, we just need to sell more. We don't worry about risk. We'll worry about risk when risk comes up. How do you both, when you talk with individuals that you can tell like this isn't a big priority for them, they want sales and marketing, they got to get product out the door. Like, what do you say? Like, this is more important than you realize. Why is that? And then also, you said there's tools, there's AI out there. Maybe talk to that a little bit, that from individuals that may not think that this is possible to do with the current level they're at.
Yeah. So let's start with the foundation from your perspective, being sales and marketing. If there are certain products that are needed for you to deliver your performance to the street, okay, and it's not usually just an individual product, but it's a basket of goods. If you know where those baskets of goods are coming from, you can identify the lanes that those goods need to flow through and the regions of the world in which those goods will be produced and manufactured. You would want someone, whether it be you in sales and marketing or supply chain, looking at daily feeds to make sure that the flow of goods that you're expecting will be available for you to deliver on your sales targets will in fact be available, so that customers can buy what it is you promise that you'll sell, right? So that's the reality. The reality is, again, supply chain as we define it is the point from raw material sourcing to the end consumption of a finished good by a consumer. That's supply chain and all activities in between. Sales and marketing is the activity in between, which takes distribution, puts it either in a retail store or puts it in a position in a salesman's hand to be able to sell it to a customer or end consumer. Their activities and their promise to the executive C-suite is inventory is going to be available to the demand that I've told you I need and that I can sell. There needs to be a monitoring process that says, yes, I can deliver that, or no, I can't. Risk management is the monitoring of things that can impact the flow of goods to either give you comfort that I'm on track, there's no reason why I can't get what I need, or, hey, I've had a fire in a factory, which is my main producer of this product. Just be aware I can only get 20% of the goods because that factory's down. It's going to be, out for 6 weeks before it gets its repair. Know that you're going to be out for a period of time, and these are all the products that are affected. What can you do to transition your customers to other products that are similar that they may not naturally buy? How do we adjust our selling strategy for those clients to attract them to go to products that I do have and that are deep in that they may not naturally buy, and maybe reduce price, take a margin hit so I sustain them as a customer, but I move them rather than losing the business to the supply that I can get, and even go deeper in that product because I know I can get additional supply and availability. That's the kind of engagement you want from a risk register point of view.
What's happened is because risks have become more and more of an issue, the difference between large and middle-sized companies is as follows. Both have concerns about risk. The question is, how much do you invest in protecting yourself from those? To Scott's point, if you're selling a product, even if you're making it, you're getting your raw materials from certain suppliers. So what if one of your suppliers, that's the only supplier you have for that material, has a fire? What do you do? So you have what has opened the door to procurement, basically, to say we need to learn more about where we're getting our materials or our products from and what can happen to those. Geopolitical concerns are more important today than they ever were, with trade agreements and Straits of Hormuz and things of that type. So yes, all companies need to be concerned about risk. How much they formalize the process really depends on what they're willing to put into the investment. But let's don't forget, the cost of inaction is very high. If you have a shock and you're not prepared for it, it can shut down your business for weeks or months.
So
And that
this leads to an important part of this discussion, right? Which is first is acknowledgement of risk and impacts. That's first. The second part, which is just as critical, is the duration of the impact, right? So the fact that you have noise or news that a port is shut down. So let's just say, for example, when Long Beach shut down, the fact that Long Beach is shut down, the question is, well, how long will Long Beach be shut down? Right? It's the length and duration of the shutdown that will impact your ability to clear the port and how much delayed you'll be, right? So while you can use AI to try to ascertain what's happening, you can use news feeds and the like. You ask about tools that you can use. You can use news feeds and the like, but you also want to use news feeds to get expert sort of predictions of the duration and what's the underlying issue and how long do they think it's going to last. Because if something's going to be short in duration, you probably won't take action. If something's going to be longer in duration, it's going to have impact, then you want to know it's going to be longer in duration so you can start taking action to be able to mitigate. What you'll do over time is begin to create a history of the different actions that occur and the characteristic of that action, where you can begin to predict and data mine your own database and come up with your own predictiveness of the duration of time, right? That's where AI will come in and self-learning will come in. Is initially you'll be reliant on available information from the street. Over time, you'll begin to create your own intelligence and your own way of predictiveness of how long you think it will go based on the characteristics and what you can get from the news you can get, and trying to ferret through so this hyper hysteria versus reality of what's really happening, right? You'll come up with your own way to determine the period of time, which will help you figure out what action you need to take, how you need to take it, and what are the right solutions which would mitigate the risk that you're going to impact.
one of the key metrics that's come out of this, to Scott's point, is TTR, time to recover. There needs to be a TTR for each potential risk. That involves a lot of people in the company, not just the procurement people. So that's why it's a shared business objective. We need a TTR for everything that's important.
And that's based on the severity of the impact of the risk that's realized, right? So, for example, if I have a factory and I have a fire, but the fire was only in one phase of the process, the question becomes, well, do you have a backup machine that you can put some of my flow through? If so, what supply can you give me, right? So it's very different than the entire factory was destroyed by a fire. That's a totally different level of severity, totally different TTR, to Gene's point, than if I just have a machine that had a fire and it's going to take me 6 months to recover and rebuild that machine. You still can get flow, you just will get limited flow, and your supplier will be able to help you understand the impact of that and what their mitigation strategy is and what their commitment is to helping you sustain your business. That's where, when you get into these shocks and these risks, if it is supplier-based, collaboration becomes very critical. And you've got to, one, acknowledge that the risk has occurred, but also work with your supplier to have the communication channels up and running. Talk about what the mitigation strategies are. If you remember, we talked about having a documented playbook. What you should be doing is doing that when the risk hasn't occurred. And then you should be communicating, okay, which of the 5 severity levels are we in? So what's our playbook, right? The playbook should already be created at a time that's not essential, that's not critical. If you wait to create the playbook when it is critical, you start just ad hocing and everybody starts responding, doing different things, competing things that aren't in the business's best interest. You start overbuying on certain areas, competitor products or trade-offs may or not be the right thing to do. You start just taking action you shouldn't be taking. So if you remember the pinwheel, one of those was creating the playbook of severity and strategies. That's why we recommend that be done. So that way you just basically call out what the play is. Everybody automatically knows what that means and they know the steps. It defines the owners and you just start executing given the named owners and the steps that'll happen.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I know that we've talked a lot about external, so let's transition, if that's okay with you guys, to talk about a internal risk. Walk us through a little bit of that and give the listeners an idea, because before the show we were talking and we said, okay, there's here's this pinwheel, here's all the external, but let's make sure that we talk about internal and make that clearly defined too. So Let's transition to that if that's okay.
I'll start because it's interesting to watch AI in its evolution. AI has become a risk to companies because of hallucinations. AI is being tested by a lot of people, and when they believe it's producing the right things, that's a risk. Is it really the right things based on the data you've been using, which is problem number one, and the fact that AI doesn't fully understand all the implications and so forth of that decision. So there's a risk with AI that people can relate to. It's called untested, unvalidated. That goes to data because the big risk in data is the data accurate and reliable. Companies are still fussing around with a single point of truth. What is the demand forecast, for example, and who has the best estimate of that? So those are two risks that occur to me right away. Scott, you'll have more.
Yeah, so let's put framework around it, right? When you're looking at risk, particularly internal, focus on people, process, and technology. Gene was just focused on technology, right? What could happen? What systems are we using that could potentially fail? What information could be corrupted? And what's our backup plan to be able to complete it? So, for example, if we're using technology that determines how I build out a truck for delivery and also goes out to the market and uses the marketplace to basically do the rate and book our bookings, if that solution fails, what do I do? What's our plan? So that's an example of where technology can fail. Gene talked about AI and the reliance and sort of it becoming the mastermind, right? That leads to process. So how could processes break down, right? Demand forecasting tool, we find that the underlying data is doing some things, or we're not doing demand shaping. We're looking at demand purely. We're not looking at where we had out of stocks, where substitutions we purchased, and the demand needs to be reshaped back to what it would have been had it been in stock. And it takes away from the substitution that we think was bought versus the item that should have been bought. And so therefore now I'm erroneously buying, and I have a client that's doing this right now, that you're erroneously buying what's being sold, but what's being sold is being demand shaped by what's available. And the client really wants part A, but you're selling them part C because part C is available, but they really would have part A. So I keep buying more and more heavily into part C, and I'm not buying part A. So part A never gets back in stock, but that's the part that the customer really wants. So that's a process break that is enabled by technology, but is how do we use the technology and manage the technology and the risks of not managing it, and where it could lead us to erroneous places, right? Where we need to make sure that we understand the risks of the systems and that there are checks and balances to evaluate and critically review how technology is being enabled. Another example, when I set up my ERP, I set up a static lead time for every vendor for every part, and that's never dynamically addressed given the market conditions. Now I'm going to be basically doing a replenishment recommendation at the wrong cadence, where if lead times elongate beyond what I put in the system, I need to be ordering more frequently because I need to fill in that gap because it's going to take me longer to get what I need. If we're not managing how the systems are working and we're not adjusting sort of the parameters under which they're working, which is part of the process, then I'm not ordering frequently enough and I'm not going to keep myself in supply, and I'm wondering why I'm running out of stock. The people part would be the best example is what we went through with the pandemic, right? We had people that either were sick and out and they couldn't perform their role. What are our risks? What are our backups? Who takes over if Jane is the lead on a certain function, AR, Jane is out on a pandemic, can't come come work for 2 to 3 months because she's got the pneumonia and just doesn't have the energy. Who does AR? Who picks it up? How does it get covered, right? So what are the risks associated with certain functions based on people? And what's the backup? What's the plan of action? Who steps in? And that person then takes on additional work. So who steps in to help support them? How do you sort of swizzle people to cover what needs to be covered and recognize that you're going to do a game plan to sort of shift people around? What does that game plan shift look like, and how do you prepare for it? So keep all of these in context of people, process, and technology. And if you do, you can clearly begin to see how those three elements lead to the internal risks that the organization can deal with.
Yeah, great point. I have to quit when did a risk program for a company once, and I said, don't forget human error. And they said, oh, we'll never have human error. Our people really know what they're doing. I don't have to tell you what happened not too long after that. So human error can cause a major shock. And they upgraded their risk program after that for sure.
The big thing when you think about risk is assume anything and everything could go wrong.
Yeah.
So how would I be exposed if I did AR wrong? and what could cause it to go wrong. You almost have to take the antithesis view, not that everything's going to go right, but if it broke, what would I do if it broke and how could it break?
Yeah.
If someone has sort of the ownership of risk and looks at each function internally from that perspective, you can then begin to monitor the key elements, the key things that would break, at least get a readout. All you're trying to do is get some kind of readout, some kind of report, some kind of a scorecard, if you will. That's what we call it, a risk register, a scorecard that compares, for example, what you sold, your AR and your AP, right? How in tune are they? And get a balanced metric that looks at, are they in tune or are they not, right? Some way to measure and track, is something out of balance with something else? Because what if it is out of balance? You got to think about it from this perspective. If the business gets out of balance, how do you go find out what's out of balance, why it's out of balance, and how do you go attack it? Yeah. A risk register gives you that way to see what is working properly and what's not working properly, so that you can quickly go and attack the things that aren't working properly, so that you can get it back in balance.
Right. Good.
And it should be very visual, like we talked about with the balanced scorecard.
Yeah.
That's why these two are very similar topics, right? The risk register feeds the balanced scorecard. The risk register is holistic to the business, looking at what could impact the business and adversely impact the business performance, and create a monitoring system that gives feedback. And if the business begins to experience a risk, the balanced scorecard should be adjusted to now incorporate the risk that they're concerned about and begin to manage it very actively and manage the impact that has to the business. So again, tying scorecard, the balanced scorecard and the risk register, they're intertwined, and the balanced scorecard should be the dynamic recipient of the risk management program that we're articulating today.
Right. Yep.
Okay, so what should be, let's think about this for a second. So you implement what we've been talking about today, and maybe if you've done it in the past with clients and if you do it with future clients, maybe one of them if is listening right now, but what should be some of the takeaways after you really start to look at risk management and you really start to assess it? Like, let's say they've been reluctant in the past to really look at it, and now it's something that you all have implemented. Maybe you've done it in the past or maybe in the future. What should be some of those feelings that they feel of like, okay, I have a better grasp of this. This is the value that we're creating. Like, what's the scenario of after you successfully start to implement stuff like this?
Yeah, so let's talk about just for a second at a high level. AI is an enabler to this. So the problem in the past has been data aggregation. And how do you data mine and actually get the data to populate a comprehensive review of the business, both internally and externally? AI is the great enabler. So what happened in the last 5 to 10 years, there have been data aggregators that have burst on the scene to be able to provide these services, to provide aggregated data. You see it on freight information, international freight. You see it on transportation information domestically. AI enables you to be able to go out and pull that data and pull it real time into your own environment. So the breakthrough is AI helps enable the creation of a robust risk management program. It's a matter of setting up the feeds to be able to consume that data, analyze the data, and provide feedback in an easy to read, easy to manage form to highlight in a red, green, yellow where you have issues and where you don't, or some kind of rating scale from 1 to 10. That's really what you're trying to do, is you're trying to elevate where there's something happening that the business doesn't know. And you're trying to say, hey team, wake up. We just had this risk. You may not be aware of it yet, but we have it. Let's figure out what we're going to do and how we're going to respond, right? So it's getting the data feeds. It's what do we want? And it's one of those things that's going to sort of evolve over time. You can't gobble it in one big feast. You got to sort of work your way through it area by area, function by function, focus on those things where you have the most exposure first, working to where you have the least exposure, and you develop sort of the scorecard of each of those elements and build it over time and recognize it needs to become a living, breathing program that the business needs to invest in, and that needs to be part of the way the business manages itself. Go ahead, Gene. I'm sorry.
I was just going to reinforce that by saying we see one of the big gaps is a company will get interested in risk management, set something up, and then let it die. In other words, it goes away until they have one. That's, to Scott's point, and I'm going to reinforce that. If you have a document you're using in monthly meetings, it's got to be a living document. It's got to change based on what's going on with those risks you worry about. So continuation is critical. And then I think the other problem is sometimes they'll say, we don't need any more investment in risks. We've got a program already. We have a look at it, and it's really not going to help in anything. I saw one risk management program, and their action plan was, who do we call? That is not an action plan for a risk. So you have to sort of judge the quality of the action plan, because if one does hit you, or you're concerned about one and it's imminent, you better have that action plan on that guidebook you have and say, here's what we got to start doing right now. And a lot of that is talking to customers, by the way. We probably should have mentioned that. If you've got a risk in your business that's somewhat imminent, you need to talk to your customers and let them. Nobody likes surprises. And sure, you have fires, or you have weather and so forth, or you have some other shock. You better be prepared for getting on that before it occurs.
So I think we would all agree that we would consider this the information age.
Yeah.
We have information at our fingertips. What we're proposing is you use that information now to help manage your business better than you ever could in the past. And it needs to be an active listening, not a passive listening.
Yeah.
So those that have created risk programs, many of those that created risk programs have done it just purely to put in their financial reports that they have a program and it's a static system. We're saying no, given the way information flows today, it needs to be active. It needs to be dynamic. It needs to be robust enough to capture all the different things that could possibly hit you. And all you're doing is someone monitors it and elevates to the business when a risk has hit the business that's big enough that the team needs to react to it.
Yep.
So transitioning Value Creation Nation, you guys are adding this value. Obviously, you're giving away years and years of industry knowledge. So if someone's listening to this, obviously eMate Consulting is what you all do. That's your consulting. What does it look like in the very beginning if someone says, you know what, Scott, Gene, I need help with this? What does it look like from a standpoint of working with two individuals that have been in this for so long, in the industry years that you have? What does it look like to help them with this?
The very first thing we do is assessment. So we say, where are you on risk management? We talk to the management people. Do they have a process? Do they have risk owners? Do they have a council? What are they doing about risk? And we make that assessment. Along with that, what's the culture of the company? I mean, you have to really identify how the company works now, because some of the pushback will be, we're too busy. We don't have time to do a risk management process. We'll just do our best to get ready for one. So you've got to raise the question with management, especially if it's enterprise-wide. What are you doing about risks? Are you satisfied with it or not? Are we satisfied that you're doing the right things for your company? Scott?
Yeah, so that's kind of what they're doing. Again, our approach is always to start at the strategy level and work our way down. So we would start with, hey, if it's a new client, what is your differentiator? What is it you're trying to deliver to the market? What is its critical? Tell me the things that you have to get right to be able not only to sustain the business, but take market share.
Yeah.
Okay. From that, then you work out to say, okay, given that, tell me the functions or areas of the world in which the products are coming from, the product categories, and we can do some deep dive to say goods are coming from these regions. And then we dig into, okay, so this is critical to you, but how closely are you monitoring the activities that are happening in these parts of the world, or that are happening to ensure that you have what you need to be able to deliver on your promise, right? So we like to always work from strategy to be able to work down from high level to the detail. Yeah. On why is it important? Why is it not important? Because to Gene's point, most times people are just starting with, well, I had this problem at one point, so now I'm monitoring it, right? And it becomes, and that's what happens a lot of times, particularly in small businesses, where, hey, it happens in inventory, right? I remember the one time I ran out of inventory, so I'm never going to run out of it again because the boss yelled at me. So I'm always going to have twice what I think I need because I never want to run out, right?
Yeah.
That meant same kind of thing happens throughout the entire organization, happens with risk. And so if you ever had a risk, you're always going to make sure you have a plan for it. If you've never had it before, you're not going to have a plan for it. If you're not monitoring a place where it could happen and never happened before, you're probably going to have a blind spot to it and not be aware of what's happening and monitoring it to be sure that it doesn't happen. It's really around the prioritization of where to look, where to watch, and what is impactful. That's why I said it's a dynamic process, because the products that are imperative to meet your performance targets change from period to period. And so therefore, the things that you're honed in on that you're uber sensitive to will change from period to period. And so it's an alignment with sales and operations and finance on what are we going to monitor collectively to ensure we deliver on the expectation. We've got to deliver to our shareholders. If we're going to deliver to shareholders, what are the products we got to fund? And if we have a supply gap, what are we going to do? That leads to sales saying, as Gene talked about, okay, I got a supply problem. Okay, operations team, go figure it out. Figure out what supply you can get me. I'll talk to my customers and figure out how I can get them to purchase other things. Finance, tell me how much I can discount to be able to deliver and how I can keep us running and deliver to the promise that I gave you. So that's why, but all that planning and all that coordination starts with an acknowledgement. I've got a problem. Houston, we got a problem. And so if you don't have that sensitivity to I got a problem, the proactive responsiveness doesn't happen.
That Scott reminded me of one other point, and I think this is important about mindset. I had one CEO say, I don't want any more naysayers. I don't want any more pessimists. Everybody here, if you turn everybody here into a risk manager, they're all going to find problems with everything. I said, no, what you have to do is turn risk management into a positive value creation and not a negative value diminisher. And you do that by getting people to focus on the most critical ones and have an action plan because they're so critical and make it a positive thing. So it's a mindset that we really have to change it sometimes.
No, I think Gene had a great point, right? Risk management is an active function. It leverages all the technology capabilities that have burst onto the scenes here in the recent years. AI enables risk management. It is a program that has to be managed on a daily and weekly basis. It is not something that's done periodically, quarterly, yearly. It needs to be done regularly. And it's one, an acknowledgement of what's happening, but two, a way to determine the length of what's happening and whether it has impact to you or not. So there's a little bit of science that has to be done. And if you get on it early and start developing the insights and information, the characteristics, you can come up with your own predictiveness, relying less on the quote unquote experts in the industry who give their view of what the duration will be. You can begin to create your own forecast of the reaction and proactively begin to manage your business based on the priority of the impact to you and what you need to do to deliver to the street.
Perfect. Thank you, Lane. Good.
Thanks, Lane.